Dawn, November 20, 1943. The Central Pacific sun bleeds a pale, watery light over the lagoon, on the tiny palm-fringed atoll of Bitio, in the Tarawa Atoll of the Gilbert Islands, a profound silence hangs. Heavy in the humid air, for Lieutenant Keiji Shibazaki and his 4,836 defenders, this silence is a weapon. They have spent months transforming this sliver of coral into a fortress. Steel-reinforced pillboxes squat low in the sand, coconut log bunkers layered with sand and armor are virtually invisible. The stench of stagnant water, diesel fuel, and human sweat is the perfume of their resolve. Then a low hum disturbs the stillness. It is not the sound of an engine, but of the horizon itself beginning to move. To the lookouts peering through binoculars, the sea begins to darken. Ships, not a handful, not a fleet, but a city of steel emerging from the vastness. Troop transports, oily tankers, sleek destroyers, and most terrifying of all, the hulking, flat-topped silhouettes of aircraft carriers. The hum deepens into a thunderous vibration as the first waves of carrier-based aircraft scream overhead. The world dissolves into noise and fire, but for the Japanese soldier watching from his bunker slit, the true shock is not the explosion of the first shells. It is the sight of the endless gray wall of ships, a sprawling, impossible manifestation of industrial power that stretches to the edge of the world. He sees the machine, and in that moment he knows. The road to Tarawa was paved with the grand, flawed strategies of two empires on a collision course across the world's largest ocean. For Japan, the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 was not an act of conquest, but a desperate gambit for time. Their objective was to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and swiftly seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, the oil of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber of Malaya. To protect this new empire, they conceived the absolute national defense sphere, a vast perimeter of island fortresses stretching from the Kurils in the north, through the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, and down to the Bismarck Archipelago. This perimeter was a shield designed to absorb and bleed dry any American counteroffensive, making the cost of victory so high that the United States would seek a negotiated peace. The United States, however, had no intention of negotiating. The American war machine, once a sleeping giant, was now roaring to life. The strategy that emerged, championed by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, was island hopping, also known as leapfrogging. It was a campaign of surgical ruthlessness. Instead of assaulting every fortified Japanese position, Allied forces would isolate and bypass strongholds, seizing only the islands necessary to create a stepping-stone path to the Japanese home islands. The criteria were clear: airfields and anchorages. Each captured island would extend the range of American land-based aircraft and provide a forward base for the fleet, tightening a noose around Japan's maritime supply lines. The first major test of this strategy would be in the Central Pacific, a direct thrust at the heart of Japan's defensive sphere. The Gilbert Islands, a British colony seized by the Japanese in 1941, were the first barrier. And at the center of the Gilberts was Tarawa Atoll. Its key was Bitio, a tiny island barely 2 miles long and half a mile wide, but on Bitio sat what was, in 1943, one of the most formidable Japanese air bases in the Central Pacific. Its capture was essential. For the Americans, it would provide a vital airfield to support the next leap into the Marshall Islands. For the Japanese, its loss would breach their outer defense line and expose their Central Empire to direct assault. Both sides understood its significance. The stage was set for a battle that would be, by any measure, a brutal experiment in the limits of human endurance and military power. The American plan, Operation Galvanic, was a masterpiece of complexity, involving vast armada, the largest yet assembled in the Pacific, but its success hinged on a deceptively simple and tragically flawed assumption about the tides at Bitio. This strategic imperative set two powerful forces on a collision course, with a tiny coral island as their anvil. The man tasked with its defense was as determined as the architects of its assault. The defense of Bitio was entrusted to Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, a charismatic and confident commander. He took over from the more cautious Rear Admiral Tamanari Seikairo and accelerated the island's fortification with a fanatical energy. under his direction. BTO became a labyrinth of death. 500 pillboxes and strongpoints were constructed, many using captured British 8-inch coastal defense guns. The island was littered with anti-tank ditches, minefields, and tetrahedrons to obstruct landing. Craft, its garrison, the 3rd Special Base Force, and the 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force were not regular Army infantry. They were elite Japanese naval troops, hand-picked. For their toughness and indoctrinated in the code of Bushido, they were prepared to fight to the last man. Shibazaki's confidence was captured in a statement he reportedly made to his men. "Million Americans cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. His strategy was one of defense in depth, unlike earlier island defenses that focused on defeating the enemy. At the water's edge, Shibazaki prepared for a prolonged, grinding battle of attrition. His interlocking fields of fire were designed to channel the invading Marines into pre-sighted killing zones. The entire island was zeroed in by his artillery and mortars. He knew he could not be resupplied or reinforced. His mission was simple: inflict casualties so catastrophic that the American public's will to fight would break. Facing them was the U.S. 2nd Marine Division, veterans of the grueling Guadalcanal campaign. They were tough, experienced, and led by the aggressive Major General Julian C. Smith. The American plan called for a direct, 3-pronged assault. The Marines would land on the northern shore of Batio, with 3 battalion landing teams, hitting beaches designated Red 1, Red 2, and Red 3. Their success depended entirely on a massive naval and air bombardment to neutralize the Japanese defenses, and on a cooperative neap tide that would allow their landing craft, particularly the new landing vehicle-tracked LVT or Amtrak, to cross the fringing coral reef that surrounded the island. As the American Task Force 53 under Rear Admiral Harry Hill, steamed toward Batio, it represented something new in warfare. It was not just a fleet of warships but a floating warehouse, a machine of unprecedented scale. Aboard the transports were the Marines, but also thousands of tons of ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and spare parts. Accompanying them were tankers, repair ships, and salvage vessels. This was not a raiding party. It was a project of occupation, and its arrival was a statement of intent that Admiral Shibazaki was about to witness firsthand. The silence of the Pacific morning was about to be shattered by the opening notes of a symphony of destruction. With the 2 forces poised for a cataclysm, the battle would be decided not by a single act of heroism, but through the complex interplay of multiple brutal factors. Shall I begin the first section of the angles, focusing on the human experience of the Japanese defender and the technological response of the U.S. Navy? For the Japanese soldier in his bunker, the waiting was a form of psychological warfare. Cut off from home, surrounded by the vast, empty ocean, his world had shrunk to this hot, humid island of coral and sand. Letters from home were a distant memory. Resupply was a forgotten dream. His existence was defined by the monotonous routine of drill, maintenance, and the slow, meticulous improvement of his defensive position. He lived in a subterranean world, his skin perpetually caked with salt and sand, his lungs filled with the damp, musty air of the bunker. The code of Bushido was his spiritual armor, promising honor in death and a place at the Yasukuni shrine. This belief system was his army's greatest strength and its most profound weakness. It fostered an incredible capacity for sacrifice, but it also bred a contempt for the enemy, whom they saw as materialistic, individualistic, and weak-willed. They believed one Japanese soldier was the equal of 10 Americans. They were prepared to test that ratio to its bloody conclusion. While the Japanese defender relied on spiritual fortitude, the American attacker was empowered by an industrial miracle, the most critical technological advantage at Tarawa was not a weapon, but a support system, the U.S. Navy's nascent mobile service. Squadrons, for the first time in naval history, a fleet could remain on station, thousands of miles from a major base, indefinitely. These floating service units, comprised of tankers, ammunition ships, repair ships, floating dry docks, and hospital ships, were a revolution. They allowed the combat vessels to remain in the fight, their fuel bunkers topped off, their magazines replenished, their battle damage repaired at sea. This was the fleet that came to stay. It stood in stark contrast to the Imperial Japanese Navy, which had to retreat to distant anchorages like Truk for maintenance and resupply. Ceding the initiative, this logistical web meant that the bombardment of Betio was not a brief pre-invasion strike. It was the opening phase of a sustained, industrial-scale application of force that could be maintained for days, weeks, or as long as it took. The battle for the island would be won or lost in the first 76 hours, but the machine that supported it was built for a war of years. These two angles, the isolated spirit versus the unending supply line, set the stage for a clash of philosophies. The battle itself would be decided by the brutal application of tactics and the stark contrast in leadership ideologies. The American plan for neutralizing Betio's defenses relied on a monumental application of firepower. The pre-invasion bombardment was intended to be the most concentrated in history to that point. Battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers stood offshore there, massive guns poised to hammer the island. The doctrine, however, was evolving. In earlier campaigns, the focus had been on precision, targeting specific gun emplacements and fortifications. At Tarawa, while precision was still the goal for the larger guns, a new reality was dawning: the sheer resilience of deeply dug-in fortifications. The solution was saturation. The 3-day naval bombardment followed by aerial strikes was designed not just to destroy, but to obliterate. It was meant to tear up the island's landscape, detonate ammunition dumps, and kill defenders through concussive force alone. Yet it would prove tragically insufficient. Fears of hitting the Marines' own approaching landing craft on D-Day caused the bombardment to be lifted prematurely. Many Japanese emplacements, built with meters of reinforced concrete and sand, survived even direct hits from 16-inch shells. The bombardment churned the sand and shattered the palm trees, but it left the core of Shibazaki's killing machine intact, waiting in a stunned but functional silence for the landing craft to arrive. The battle showcased a fundamental clash in military leadership. On the American side, the operation was a testament to the managerial class. Admiral Raymond Spruance, the overall commander, was a brilliant, calculating strategist. Admiral Hill, the amphibious force commander, was a master of complex fleet operations. Their decisions were based on logistics, schedules, and firepower ratios. They waged war from charts and maps. Their authority derived from a system of delegated command and technological superiority. Opposite them stood Admiral Shibazaki, the last samurai. His leadership was personal, charismatic, and rooted in a warrior ethos. He moved among his men, sharing their hardships, his presence, and inspiration. His command bunker was his castle, and he was prepared to die in its ruins. This contrast extended to their view of the soldier. 2. The American command, a Marine, was a valuable, highly trained asset, part of a system that aimed as much as possible to expend material to save lives. To Shibazaki, his sailor infantry were instruments of his will, their ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate expression of their duty. One side fought a war of production, the other a war of devotion. As the bombardment fell silent and the first landing craft churned toward the reef, the theoretical angles of the conflict collapsed into the brutal, personal reality of the assault. The climax was at hand. H-hour 0900, November 20, 1943. The first wave of Amtraks, bearing the assault troops of the 2nd Marine Division, churned through the lagoon. The anticipated high tide had not materialized. The ocean itself seemed to have betrayed the plan. The water over the reef was dangerously shallow. The deeper draft Higgins boats, carrying follow-on waves and vital reinforcements, ground to a halt hundreds of yards from the beach. Marines were ordered to transfer to Amtraks returning from the first wave, but under heavy fire. This became a chaotic and bloody process. Many had no choice but to wade ashore. The sea turned red. Japanese machine gunners, emerging from their shaken but intact bunkers, opened fire with methodical, murderous precision. From their enfiladed positions, they had clear lines of fire across the entire lagoon. The waiting Marines were trapped in a killing zone. With no cover, men were cut down in chest-deep water. Others, weighed down by their equipment, drowned. The water was strewn with the dead and dying. The first reports Reaching the command ship, the USS Maryland, were catastrophic, have landed heavy. Opposition, then the more desperate, casualties severe, another message stark and terrifying issue in doubt. On Red Beach 1, a handful of Amtraks managed to cross the seawall, disgorging Marines who secured a tiny, precarious foothold. On Red 2 and 3, the situation was even. More dire, units were decimated, their commanders killed, their cohesion lost. The battle had disintegrated into a series of small, isolated fights for survival. The American plan, so meticulously crafted, had shattered on the reef and the unbroken Japanese defenses. For a few critical hours, it seemed that Shibazaki's prediction might come true. The entire invasion teetered on the brink of a bloody, humiliating failure. The battle's outcome hung by a thread, but as the first day wore on, the very logistical machine the Japanese had witnessed from afar began to assert its decisive influence. The turning point at Tarawa was not a single dramatic charge, but a slow, grinding and inexorable process fueled by American adaptability and logistical depth. As the lead elements of the Marines fought for their lives on the beaches, the American machine shifted into a higher gear. Destroyers, ignoring the risk of shore batteries, moved perilously close to the island to provide pinpoint gunfire support, blasting Japanese positions mere yards from the pinned-down Marines. Offshore, the flow of men and material, though hampered by the tide, never fully stopped. Damaged Amtraks were repaired or replaced. Wounded men were evacuated to hospital ships. Ammunition and water were shuttled forward. The critical advantage was communication and command, while Japanese leadership was fractured after a naval shell destroyed Shibazaki's command bunker, severing the head of the defense. The American command structure, though strained, remained functional. Colonel David M. Shoup, the regimental commander who waded ashore through the hellish fire, established a makeshift command post on the pier and began to coordinate the battle with grim determination. His famous message to headquarters captured the chaos: "We are in a mighty tight spot, but we are digging in and sticking." Throughout the second day, the Americans leveraged their material superiority. Sherman tanks finally landed, began to systematically reduce pillboxes with direct cannon fire. Bulldozers, themselves acts of engineering genius in this context, were used to seal bunker embrasures with sand, burying their occupants alive. Flamethrowers became the weapon of choice, clearing fortifications with terrifying finality. The Japanese launched desperate, fanatical banzai charges on the nights of the second and third days. They were not tactical maneuvers to regain ground, but spiritual exercises in seeking an honorable death. They were cut down by the hundreds by American machine guns and artillery, their bodies piling up in front of the Marine lines, each charge further depleted the already dwindling Japanese force. The American line, constantly reinforced and supplied, bent but did not break. The individual courage of the Marine was undeniable. But it was the unending stream of bullets, beans, and bandages from the fleet that allowed that courage to be effective. By the morning of the fourth day, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The relentless, mechanical process of American combat had overwhelmed the static, sacrificial defense. The final, brutal suppression of resistance on BTO left a scar on the island and on the conscience of a nation. The time had come to count the cost and comprehend the lessons. The silence that returned to BTO on November 23rd was of a different quality than the one that preceded the battle. This was a dead, hollow silence, broken only by the waves and the cries of gulls. The island was a scorched lunar landscape, not a single tree remained standing. The air was thick with the stench of death, a smell that would cling to the survivors for life. The human cost was staggering. Of the approximately 4,836 Japanese defenders, only 17 wounded soldiers and 129 Korean laborers were taken alive. The rest lay where they had fallen, in bunkers, trenches, and the open ground, where their charges had ended. The American victory had been purchased at a terrible price. The 2nd Marine Division suffered nearly 3,000 casualties in 76 hours of fighting, over 1,000 killed and almost 2,200 wounded. The images and newsreels that reached the American public sparked a firestorm of controversy. How could such losses be sustained for such a tiny insignificant piece of coral. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps launched immediate and intense investigations. The lessons were brutally clear. The pre-invasion bombardment, though massive, had been too short and had failed to target reinforced structures. Effectively, the tidal data had been catastrophically wrong. Communications between ship and shore had broken down at critical moments. Strategically, however, the verdict was unequivocal. The airfield on Betio was operational. Within days of its capture, American Liberator bombers were soon using it to strike the next targets in the Marshall Islands. The island-hopping strategy had proven viable. If bloody, the U.S. had learned it could storm a heavily fortified Central Pacific atoll and win, but the most profound lesson, one that would shape every subsequent operation, from Saipan to Iwo Jima, was the understanding of the Japanese soldiers' willingness to die in place. There would be no more underestimating the defense. From now on, the American response would be an even greater, more systematic application of overwhelming force. The battle was over, but its impact would ripple across the Pacific fundamentally, altering the conduct of the war and sealing Japan's fate. Tarawa became a grim but essential template. The U.S. military institutionalized its hard-won knowledge. Naval bombardment plans were extended from hours to days, even weeks. The allocation of ammunition for pre-invasion strikes increased exponentially. Underwater demolition teams, UDT, the precursors to the Navy SEALs, were formally established to reconnoiter landing beaches and clear obstacles. The production of Amtraks was prioritized, and newer, better-armored models were rushed into service. The entire logistical apparatus was refined, making the flow of men and material to the beachhead more resilient and responsive. The fleet that came to stay grew larger, more capable, and more efficient. For Japan, the loss of Tarawa was a strategic catastrophe from which they could not recover. It proved that their absolute national defense sphere was permeable. The myth of the invincible island fortress was broken. More terrifyingly for Imperial General Headquarters, Tarawa demonstrated the horrifying efficiency of the American war machine. They had expected to bleed the Americans and force a negotiation. Instead, they witnessed an enemy that could absorb horrific losses, learn from its mistakes instantly, and return with even greater, more destructive force. The American capacity to project power across thousands of miles of ocean and sustain a high-intensity battle on a remote atoll was a logistical feat the Japanese Empire could not hope to match. Every subsequent battle followed the pattern set at Tarawa, only on a larger and more devastating scale. At Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the Japanese defenders replicated Shibazaki's defense in depth, and the Americans responded with the lessons of Tarawa: longer, heavier bombardments, more Amtraks, more flamethrowers, and more of everything. The Japanese defender, seeing the endless American supplies and replacements, understood the ultimate truth. He was not fighting an army, he was fighting a nation's entire industrial and economic might, delivered to his shore with terrifying precision. His defeat was not a matter of courage, but of mathematics. The machine was inevitable. Tarawa stands as a brutal pivot point in the history of warfare. It was a battle where the ancient virtues of the warrior, courage, fortitude, loyalty unto death, confronted the modern realities of industrial production and logistical planning, and the industrial reality won. The battle demonstrated that in the mid-20th century, the capacity to produce, transport, and maintain, to keep the bullets flying, the fuel pumping, and the men fed was as decisive a weapon as any rifle or battleship. The American victory was not merely a triumph of arms, but a triumph of organization, a testament to a nation that could build a floating, mobile base of operations and project its power across an ocean. For the Japanese soldier, the sight of that unending fleet was the sight of his own fate. He was not defeated by a better man, but by a better system. In the end, the sands of Betio were not just stained with blood, they were measured in tons of steel, in gallons of fuel, in the relentless, impersonal calculus of production that would come to define the modern world. The battle for that tiny island taught a somber, eternal lesson that the will to fight, however fierce, must ultimately be sustained by the means to do so.